Good morning. Welcome to Amplify Festival. Welcome to our GLT members, our sponsors, our guests, and our audience across the globe. My name is Mujda Zainal. I'm currently working for IT at AMP, and I will be your host for the next session. Amplify is not just a talk fest, it's an innovation festival as well. You can follow us on social media using the hashtag AmplifyFest. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And via the iTunes app, you can check into this session and ask your questions. Our next session is actually sponsored by Deloitte, and our sponsor will be introducing John Hagel. John has been twice before an Amplify speaker, and we are very lucky to have him this year again here in Sydney. He will be speaking about rethinking the ecosystems of business at the change of an era. John will speak for roughly 20 to 25 minutes. When finished, we'd like to have a conversation about what we've just heard. So we'll have a Q&A session where you can ask questions. We also encourage staff in other locations to submit questions via our live stream platform. We'll start wrapping up our session by 10:50 as we need to move on with our next Amplify session. I now call on the lead partner, Deloitte Digital and Asia Pacific, Mr. Frank Farrell, to shortly introduce John Hagel.
Thank you. So it's always great to have John back in Australia, and I get the pleasure of seeing John speak quite a lot, but over video conference. So it's actually fantastic to have him back in country. So by ways of introduction, John is the co-chairman of Deloitte's Center for the Edge, which is our Silicon Valley-based research group that looks at what we call over-the-horizon topics. So these are topics related to digital technology and business model change that we believe that CEOs and their executive teams need to be thinking about, but it's probably a little early for that to be on their direct agenda. John he's a faculty member and lecturer at Singularity University, where he's also working with executives and students to look at the impact of exponential technologies and the pace of business change and what this is doing in terms of creating pressure on performance for firms and how that they can best respond in a world of digital disruption. John is frequently sought out for his views by the Tier 1 media. He's a frequent contributor to Fortune Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the BBC, Harvard Business Review, and the like. So he's considered a thought leader in his field. John's also the author of a recent book called The Power of Pull, which looks at, again, the competitive pressures that are being brought on by digital technology and how firms and individuals then have to respond in this new world. We've taken a lot of John's work and created the Shift Index, which is a piece of research that we use to help our clients to consider how they're responding to digital disruption and how as the power shifts from firms to consumers, what that means for their business. So John today is going to speak to us about ecosystems and very much around how in this digitally disrupted world, how important ecosystems are, but more importantly, how we're moving from an ecosystem arrangement that's very transactional, where you as a firm go into an ecosystem in order to access capability, to one that's what he refers to as relational, where every firm and an individual in that ecosystem is working together to try to amplify the overall performance of that group of firms and individuals. So I'm really excited to hear what John has to say today, and please join me in welcoming John for his presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to share with you some of our perspectives on ecosystems in business. It's a bit daunting because it's such a large and complex topic, and I'm going to try to just quickly go over some broad views as to why these ecosystems are increasingly important in business. I think one of the things that strikes me, I love paradox, as you might be able to tell from the title of my research center, the Center for the Edge. Paradox is something that I embrace and relish. The paradox in terms of ecosystems is that at a time of mounting performance pressure, an era that we call the big shift, where more than ever we need the help of others, in fact, business seems to be moving away from ecosystems. Large companies are reducing the number of participants in their supply networks, their distribution channels, all in the name of efficiency. It's more efficient to have fewer participants. And at the same time, I think part of the motivation, and this is something I won't go into in great detail in my talk, but I've become more and more interested in, is the psychological impact of mounting performance pressure. And one of the implications of mounting pressure is that we tend to want to control things more tightly because there's so much that could go wrong. And ecosystems, in many respects, can be quite scary in that context. The illusion, at least, is that you have a lot more control if things go on within your enterprise than if it's spread out across multiple entities. So let me just start by defining ecosystems, because I think, again, one of the challenges I face when I talk to executives about this is everybody uses the term. It's one of the most used terms in business, and yet everyone has a somewhat different meaning attached to an ecosystem. At a very high level, I'm going to focus on intentional ecosystems. There are lots of ecosystems that emerge spontaneously without anyone planning or designing them. I'm focusing on intentional ones where someone or some group has decided to try to mobilize a large number of independent participants to work together to achieve some kind of shared goal. And that's broadly what an ecosystem is, at least in our work. Now, having said that, some of the research we've done actually looks at, we've identified at least 12 different types of ecosystems, business ecosystems, that are available. And yet we use the term so loosely, and yet each one of those 12 ecosystems has very different business objectives, has very different ways of managing those ecosystems, and even very different metrics in terms of how you would evaluate the performance and evolution of those ecosystems. So we think it's really important to drill down and say exactly what kind of ecosystem are you really talking about and could add the most value to your enterprise, and rather than talking very loosely about the term. I'll resist the temptation to go through all 12 of these different types of ecosystems and focus on just one distinction that we think is becoming more and more important in terms of thinking about ecosystems. And Frank hinted at it in the introduction. It's a distinction between, on one level, what we would call static ecosystems. And what we mean by that is the mindset for a static ecosystem is, as a company, as an executive, I know there are some resources beyond my company that I need to connect to. A given set of resources, capabilities, skills that I need to connect to and mobilize in my market. But the view is a very static one. It's a given set of resources. My only job is to figure out who has them and how to connect to them and how to mobilize them. There's a very different kind of ecosystem model, which I would describe as a dynamic or relational ecosystem model, which says actually the motivation for forming an ecosystem is not because there's a set of resources out there that can be connected and mobilized, but the belief that actually by coming together, we can learn faster and improve our performance more rapidly as an ecosystem than we could if we were just on our own or just connecting in more transactional ways. That's a very different kind of model. And at least based on our experience, very few companies today are actually pursuing that kind of dynamic ecosystem model. So in that context, let me talk a little bit about some of the opportunities, why we believe ecosystems are becoming more and more central and important to business. One of the key values of an ecosystem is around an opportunity for leveraged growth. And what do I mean by that? When I sit in a management meeting and we get to a growth topic on the agenda, the growth topic is really pretty simple. There are two options. You build it internally or you go out and buy it. And the only question on the table is how much internal growth versus acquisition is going to drive my growth strategy. Our belief is actually increasingly there's a third path to growth that is not on most management agendas, but needs to be. And it's this notion of leveraged growth. And what we mean by that is it's not going out and adding debt to your balance sheet, not that form of leverage. It's the leverage that comes from connecting to complementary resources, creating relationships with them where you both can grow faster in terms of performance, accelerate your performance improvement, and deliver more and more value into the marketplace. So you're not building it internally, you're not buying it, you're mobilizing it and delivering it to your customers in your marketplace. And very significant growth can be achieved through that third path. Yet very few companies, at least in our experience, are explicitly pursuing that third path to growth. One company that I'll just mention briefly that's intriguing in this regard in terms of pursuing ecosystems for leverage growth is a company that not many have heard of. We've been quite active in trying to build visibility around it. It's a Chinese company called Li & Fung. It's in the apparel industry. Their customers are apparel designers around the world, and they basically will take care of everything from sourcing of raw materials through all the stages of production, through logistics, out to whatever retail distribution centers you need anywhere in the world. The interesting thing about them is they actually do none of that work themselves. They operate through a global ecosystem network that they've built over time of 15,000 business partners. They are now a $20 billion revenue company, US dollars, $20 billion in revenue. Over the past 10 years, they've tripled their revenue through leverage growth, not by adding more and more people to their organization, but by adding more and more participants in their ecosystem. Very different alternative path to growth, and very powerful, yet very few companies are exploiting it. And by the way, at the same time that most Western companies are shrinking the number of participants in their ecosystem, their supply networks, Li & Fung is adding. They're at 15,000, but every day they're adding more. So they're continuing to scale and drive growth through that leverage growth path. The other related opportunity is evolving functionality, not just leverage growth, but evolving functionality. One of the interesting companies in this regard is a U.S. company, Charles Schwab, many of you are familiar with. If you go back in history, Charles Schwab basically got started as a discount broker, initially over the telephone and then over the internet. But very limited kind of value. Is basically a transaction broker, very transactionally oriented. Over time, they saw an opportunity to evolve and grow by adding more and more functionality and value to their customers, but not by doing it internally, not by adding their own capability, but by tapping into third-party databases, third-party analytics services, third-party financial advisors, and creating a very powerful ecosystem that over time essentially replicated the full service of a full-service broker, but without adding it all internally. So again, an interesting way to evolve the functionality of a company into a very different kind of value proposition to the customer based on an ecosystem approach. So growth, evolving functionality. There's a third value from ecosystems, which is distributed innovation. One of the things that we're in a world of mounting performance pressure, that we're all under increasing pressure on, is to drive more and more innovation, scale that innovation. And again, our temptation is to do it either internally, drive our own innovation facilities, or go out and buy some innovative companies and bring them in. Interesting alternative path is to use ecosystems to drive distributed innovation. Now, there's been a lot of talk about various kinds of crowdsourcing approaches to driving innovation, and I don't want to in any way diminish the value of those approaches. Those are ecosystem approaches, but they're very transactional in nature. Again, I have a specific innovation problem. Let's create a contest. Let's invite anybody to contribute an answer, and we'll give a reward of some type to the company or group that comes up with the best innovation. I'm talking about something that's a much more sustained relational innovation through an ecosystem. And in this context, I'll actually, again, you'll see a bit of a theme here, go back to China for an example. In a city by the name of Chongqing, that many have not been to from outside of China. It's a pretty large city. It's got about 20 million population. It's one of the centers for automotive and motorcycle production in China. 3 companies emerged in Chongqing that decided to take on the Japanese motorcycle vendors, compete with them. And they decided that rather than try to compete with them just by coming up with their design and manufacturing it, getting out into marketplace, they first of all said, let's modularize the design of a motorcycle. That in itself was a big innovation because the traditional motorcycle manufacturers had very tightly integrated designs. There was a single design. It was all done by one team of people and very, very clear in terms of functionality across all the elements. Their step was, first of all, to modularize the design, create distinct, independent components in the motorcycle, and then to orchestrate a design network of third-party technical expertise in all the different components of a motorcycle. And the approach basically was every 6 months, they would come up with a release of a motorcycle. And at that point in time, they would look across their design network and pick the best design solution for each component. They would work through with the partners all the interdependencies across the components. But at the end of 6 months, they would pick the best in class in their network and release a motorcycle. 6 months later, they would do exactly the same thing. So if you were part of this ecosystem and network and weren't picked for that first 6-month release, not to worry. 6 months later, you have another shot at it. And so it was a continuing drive around innovation in terms of the design and production of motorcycles. The result was that in the course of about 5 years, they reduced the average retail price of a motorcycle by 75% in 5 years. Same performance levels. They were very ruthless because the people they were selling motorcycles to were not your leisure motorcycle riders. These were people who needed the motorcycle to get to work in the morning. This was their key way to make a living. So they needed reliability, they needed performance, but they needed low cost. And through this ecosystem, very powerful network of distributed innovation emerging, where we're harnessing the power of third parties, the expertise of third parties, in a continuing round of innovation. So, let me talk also, again, this context of dynamic ecosystems and coming together because the purpose is to learn and gain performance improvement more rapidly. There's another example of an ecosystem that an SAP put together. It's their SAP community network. Many of you may be familiar with it, but basically it was an invitation to all the application developers in third parties, the third-party distribution channels, the end enterprise customers. They created an online space and they invited all the application developers to participate and pose problems. You know, as you're writing code, if you run into a coding issue, rather than just trying to sort it through yourself or talk to the people around you, post the problem. See if anybody has an answer or solution to it. Turns out that platform became extraordinarily productive and effective. It now has over 2 million participants worldwide. 2 million application developers participating from around the world. The average time to answer a question on that platform, once you pose a problem, 17 minutes until you get an answer that you certify as the one who posed the problem actually solved the problem. And the length of time is shrinking as more and more participants join the network. So an extraordinary driver of performance improvement and productivity gains through an ecosystem, going well beyond the individual companies that are participating. And what's occurring now is this ecosystem is evolving. Now they're not just engaging in transactional problem solving. Through reputation profiles, they're starting to develop rich networks of relationships in this ecosystem, coders coming together from all over the world, and increasingly many of them through those relationships deciding to form application development teams and pursuing a new application, developing a new application together through this ecosystem. So an interesting model of, again, accelerated performance improvement and learning through an ecosystem approach. Let me just quickly go through one other example of an ecosystem, the value of ecosystems, business ecosystems. And this goes to the question of business strategy. Often when we think about business strategy, we tend to focus on increasingly, I guess the buzzword is disruptive innovation. And the model of disruptive innovation is often what I would call the big bet approach to strategy. You come up with something fundamentally new and different as a company, you get it into market, you pour a ton of money into it. If it succeeds and disrupts, you win. If it doesn't, goodbye. There's a very different approach to strategy, which we've ended up becoming very intrigued by, which we call shaping strategies, which is to say in a world of more rapid change, where things are evolving at much more rapid rates, rather than just trying to react or pursue a disruptive strategy of a one company, what about mobilizing a very large ecosystem of companies to go in and restructure an entire market or industry? So you clearly have to put some money on the table as the shaper. But in the end of the day, looking at the successful shapers that we've studied, it's a tiny fraction of the total amount of investment that's being put on the table for that shaping strategy. If you're successful in mobilizing the right kinds of ecosystems, 80-90% of the investment is done by others. What you're doing is creating the incentive structure to mobilize a very large number of participants to engage and help build this different structure in a market or industry. So that's a very different kind of approach to strategy, and we've looked at a number of successful companies over time, going back to one of my favorite examples, a guy by Malcolm McLean, who was a truck driver, high school dropout truck driver in New Jersey, watching his truck being unloaded at a New Jersey port, and this was back in the 50s, came up with the idea, gee, this is really inefficient, unloading one box at a time. What if we had a container? What if we had a standardized container and could take it across ships, trucks, railroads? Long story short, he reshaped the global shipping industry around the notion of containerized shipping. Another successful shaper, a man by the name of D. Hawk, who was a mid-level executive in a Seattle bank one day in the early days of the credit card business, when it's hard to remember, but in the early days of the credit card business, all the banks were losing money in the credit card business, all struggling to make a business out of it. He came up with this idea. He said, what if we created a shared facility? All these banks are doing the same back office transaction processing. What if we had a shared facility, utility, for all the banks to do that? He ended up founding Visa. And his success as a shaper of the credit card business, restructuring at a fundamental level the credit card business, was his ability to mobilize a very large number of participants to support that new structure of the industry. So interesting examples of, again, how to harness the power of ecosystems to create more and more business value in a time of mounting performance pressure. This whole notion of leverage and learning becomes key. Now, there are a lot of elements to what's required to build a successful ecosystem. Unfortunately, I'm running out of time, but I will at least plant the seed that, in my view, one of the untapped opportunities in the area of business ecosystems is how to harness the power of narrative to motivate and mobilize very large numbers of participants on a global basis. And I think at the end of the day, that's one of the biggest opportunities that I see on the horizon in this big shift. But at the end of the day, I think what matters here is that if we get these business ecosystems right, small moves, smartly made, can set very big things in motion. And in a time of mounting pressure, when we have less and less resource available to do things, the opportunity to set really big things in motion through ecosystems is a very exciting one. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your presentation, John. No one will argue that we live in a world of accelerating change, and it's very easy to be overwhelmed by the uncertainty that change creates and just give up anticipating where the world is headed. You didn't give up anticipating how our lives, companies, industries will develop, and you have a remarkable vision of the future changes in the business ecosystems. Interestingly, Idea AMP's new statement vision is imagine tomorrow, innovate today. And your session indeed made us think about imagining tomorrow and related us to focusing on innovating today. I would encourage our audience to ask questions by putting up your hand, and please state your name and the company you work for. A microphone will be available shortly.
Thank you. John, that was an excellent performance. I really enjoyed that. Cheryl Burgess, Blue Focus Marketing. So I have a question to you. You touched upon the subject about learning and how that plays an important role in an organization. Could you give us more insights? Perhaps, should there be a chief learning officer? And if so, should they have a place in the boardroom?
Great question. Actually, certainly at least in the U.S., there are more and more chief learning officers that are being designated. I'd say, unfortunately, at least based on my experience, the charter or mandate for that chief learning officer is basically to be in charge of training programs for the company. And at least in my experience, to be a bit provocative, I will say that training programs are going to be less and less relevant to learning, and that the real powerful learning occurs day to day on the job in the work environment. And unless and until we focus on how would we redesign our work environments to accelerate learning day to day on the job, I don't think we'll achieve the potential that I think chief learning officers definitely could achieve. And I've been somewhat provocative. I've actually gone in writing saying that ultimately my belief is the CEO needs to become the chief learning officer of the company, that's essential.
John, that was wonderful, and our last speaker had us firmly fixated on the tangibles that are coming, and it was really nice to switch into thinking about narratives. I wonder if you could share with us, in your opinion, which one or some of what you think are the greatest emerging narratives that we should be pondering.
Well, again, it's a bit like ecosystems in the sense that I think we all have a somewhat different meaning of narrative. Just quickly, I'll draw the distinction between a story and a narrative, and I think there is a difference here. For me, at least, stories are self-contained. They have a beginning, a middle, and a resolution. Something happens to resolve the story. And the story is ultimately about me, the storyteller, or it's about those people over there. It's not about you. You can use your imagination, figure out what you might have done in the context of that story, but it's not about you. A narrative, in contrast, at least the way I define it, is open-ended. There is no resolution yet. There's some kind of opportunity or threat on the horizon, big, exciting, but it's not yet resolved, not yet determined whether that's going to be achieved or not. And the resolution of that narrative hinges on you. It hinges on the choices, the actions, the decisions you're going to take and make. What's it going to be? How is this narrative going to resolve? It's in essence a call to action. A very powerful call to action. Throughout history, at least the way I think about narratives, millions of people have actually sacrificed their lives for narratives. You want to talk about emotional engagement? The highest price has been paid for narratives. And I think the opportunity in business context, I actually think very few companies have what I would characterize as a narrative. One that I will cite as an example is what Apple had they condensed it down to a slogan, which was "Think Different." But if you unpack that slogan, there's a really rich narrative there, which is basically, 20, 30 years ago, we had digital technology that took away our names, gave us numbers, put us in cubicles, forced us to be cogs in a machine. And now, for the first time, there's a set of digital technology, a new generation, that allows all of us to express our uniqueness, our individuality, our potential. But it's not a given. It's not automatic. You got to think different. Are you ready to think different? Will you think different? Really powerful call to action. And I think in many respects is the reason why, for many people at least, Apple is the equivalent of a religion. I mean, they love Apple because it spoke to them at a level that was very profound and motivated them in very interesting and powerful ways. And I think part of the value of that narrative in that context was Apple was able to mobilize a really powerful and effective ecosystem of application developers and technologists around their core technology because they saw the opportunity to think different and come up with really interesting and new innovative applications, thinking different. So I think that whole notion of narrative, particularly back in a time of mounting performance pressure, has enormous potential to engage all of us at a deeply emotional level, not just a rational analytic level, and get us to do things in ways that we would never do in the absence of that narrative.
Thank you. Elizabeth Eisel of Senior Entrepreneurship Works, and we are in the process of changing the negative paradigm of aging across the globe and changing it from one of thinking of seniors as liabilities to assets. And the whole way in which to do that, we have found, is to create ecosystems. But the most challenging aspect for us is that to create a cross-sector ecosystem where you have government, education, private sector in the same arena and recognizing their role as stakeholders in changing this negative paradigm. So we have been traveling around the world doing this, but any help you can suggest in terms of how to best bring those sectors together so they realize we all have a stake in recognizing this demographic as an economic engine.
It's great. I love the vision, the aspiration. I would, after the session, put you in touch with a colleague of mine, Bill Eggers, who's been very effective in helping to kind of mobilize these cross private sector, government, NGO around these kinds of really, he calls them, rather than wicked problems, wicked opportunities that can really energize us. So definitely.
Thanks very much, John. It's Tony Hollingsworth from Digivisor. Just on the point about Charles Schwab and analytics and data being used to affect business ecosystem change, etc. Have you got any other examples of data and analytics enabling that, particularly social analytics?
Not fully at an ecosystem level. I actually think one of the biggest opportunities is, we're all familiar with this in business. Every company has so much data, and the amount of data they've actually used to create business value from the data is a tiny fraction of what's available. And the instinct and appropriate initial focus is how can we harness analytic tools ourselves to create insight and action from the data. I think there's an opportunity to think about data platforms more broadly, where we create ecosystems of analytic capability to gather insight from the data. I mean, there are some early examples. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the example of Goldcorp, a Canadian company, a mining company, that basically took data, geologic data about the properties it owned and made it available to see who could come up with the most interesting veins to tap into in the mining property. Unleashed billions of dollars of new gold that they hadn't been able to effectively tap into before. The interesting thing to me was that was a one-time effort. I mean, it goes back to that crowdsourcing that I mentioned earlier, a one-time kind of contest to see who could come up with the best insight and ideas. Really interesting notion. Why stop with a one-time contest? Why not create a platform where on an ongoing basis more and more value can be, pardon the pun, mined from the data? Obviously it has huge privacy and security kinds of issues. I don't want to in any way undermine or de-emphasize that, but I think that's part of the opportunity. If you can create a data platform where you can appropriately protect privacy and security and yet harness the power of an ecosystem to come in with very diverse kind of analytic approaches to the data to create more value from the data. I think at the end of the day, those platforms are going to be the ones that attract the most data because the most value will end up being generated from that data.
Hello, John. Ron Shaw here, writing for Forbes. I have a question. Whenever we talk about ecosystems and partnerships, we tend to think about the large partners. What do you think is the role of scale, small, large? How do we treat them?
With all the respect they deserve. I think it's a great question because, at least in our view, based on the research we've done, more and more of the ecosystems that are going to emerge on a global scale are going to be ecosystems that bring together both large and small participants. And that part of the value of the ecosystem is getting that deep specialization in a very specific area, but then the scale that comes from other participants that have access to a much broader set of resources, and respecting, again, the unique kind of contribution that each of those participants have, and creating an ecosystem where there is appropriate motivation for everyone. I think one of the challenges you see in the evolution of ecosystems often is the initial ecosystem organizer can become very greedy and start to squeeze all the other participants in the ecosystem. And to continue the growth and the performance improvement and the learning, I think it requires a recognition that every participant has a particular economics, a particular set of motivations, and the only way to maintain the vitality and growth of the ecosystem is by creating the appropriate incentive structures, and deeply understanding what those incentive structures are is, I think, a key skill.
Hi, John. My name's Chris Mendez. I'm from a company called Rosetta. I just thought I'd share with you, actually, listening to your talk, which I really appreciated around ecosystems, that one sector that I think has really done well with this is the stock trading industry. And it's one of the few ecosystems where they have solved a lot of the problems around sharing of data very widely, and not only in real time, but historically. And I think we can all see, and particularly the people who work, I think, in this company, in AMP, will actually be aware of how huge the impact of that data sharing has been. And I think, what you spoke about today really, really reinforced that to me. So just wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Stuart Candy, Situation Lab, OCAD University, Toronto. John, thanks for your talk. Just a quick question about the last point that you ended with on catalytic narratives. And I wonder, where is the most powerful catalytic narrative work being done that you're seeing? Who's telling these stories in what ways? And what are those stories? Thanks.
It's a great question, and I actually invite, I've become more and more interested in this topic and approach to how to mobilize participation in broader ecosystems. And I actually find very few examples. Again, I'm applying a pretty strict definition to a narrative, and I have not found a lot of great examples of companies. And again, I think so. You can think about narratives at many levels, right? I think there's an individual narrative. I think each of us in our lives have a narrative that we have lived our lives to. Most of us haven't taken the trouble to articulate that narrative and make it explicit. But I think if you look at the choices and actions we've taken over time, there's a very consistent narrative we've been pursuing in terms of some kind of opportunity or threat that we're striving towards. I think there are narratives that emerge in regions or countries. I mean, again, I'm from Silicon Valley. There's a very powerful narrative in Silicon Valley, right, which is, we have a digital technology that has the opportunity to change the world, but it ain't a given. It's not a given. You have to come to Silicon Valley and help change the world. Will you do it? And most people don't recognize that the majority of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley were certainly not even from Silicon Valley. They weren't even from the U.S. They were born outside the U.S. and they were drawn by this narrative and continue to pursue that narrative. It's very energizing. So I see enough examples of the power of this kind of narrative. I just hunger for more examples of institutions and companies in particular that will harness the power of the narrative to drive that kind of engagement and ecosystem growth.
Catherine Brenner, AMP. What sort of skills and characteristics should we be looking for and developing in our people and our children so that they can be the best contributors and participants in this new form of ecosystem?
Wow, that's a great question. I think at the end of the day, and this gets into a whole other topic, I'll resist the temptation to dive into too much detail, but again, everything I've talked about, we've done a lot of research on. It's freely available. I didn't use any slides, but I have a lot of research reports I can share. One of the things that I focus on, and I've done this with my two children, my girls, is rather than talk about skills, talk about finding your passion. Find your passion and pursue it. And I think if you find a passion, and again, I have a very specific form of passion in mind that we call the passion of the explorer, but one of the attributes of the passion of the explorer is it has a very deep connecting disposition. If you're really passionate in the way an explorer is, you're constantly wanting to connect out and find others who either share your passion or have relevant expertise or capability that you can use to have greater and greater impact in whatever domain you're pursuing. So my advice to younger people is, in this world, it's less about skills and more about passion. If you have the right passion, you will develop the necessary skills, and most importantly, you'll connect out to a broader set of people and institutions that will help to augment whatever skills you have. And that's a big opportunity.
We've got a question there as well.
Hi, John. Sean Gillespie from AMP. John, you gave a couple of examples of Chinese companies. Do you see a theme evolving in terms of how ecosystems are developing, be it east-west or developing versus developing economies?
It's a great question. I think, it goes back a bit historically. I first made a trip to China in 1982, a business trip. And after a period of time, after about 5 or 6 years there, not living there, but going back and forth, I became really intrigued with some of these entrepreneurial initiatives and companies that I was seeing. And I came back and I said, we ought to pay more attention to China. And one of the responses I would get from U.S. executives was, oh, come on, John. They don't have any developed financial systems, so if they're entrepreneurial companies, they're never going to get the money they need to start a company. And they have no IP protection, so even if they come up with something really innovative, they're going to get copied and go out of business right away. I think they took those two attributes, and yes, we can talk about some of the cultural aspects of China, but I'm thinking more in business and economic terms. They took those two so-called deficiencies or a lack of capability, and they turned those into a catalyst for innovation. So they said, okay, we don't have a lot of financial support to build a business, so we've got to be ruthless in figuring out what is it that we alone need to do. And if there's anybody else out there who does something that would be of value to what we're trying to do, let's connect to them rather than trying to do it all ourselves. So from the beginning, it drove them into an ecosystem or network-based view of business, which I think was very powerful. And then with the IP protection issue, it forced them into a notion of rapid iterations of innovation rather than focusing on a big bang innovation that, had risks of being copied. How do you sustain that innovation on an ongoing basis within an ecosystem?
I can take one last question. We'll have to wrap up shortly.
Neil Franklin, AMP. Do intellectual copyrights become redundant in this world, or is it the case that they've been shared in the ecosystem, at least to the point where rats even start to patent on it?
Great question. So I highly recommend, if you haven't seen it, again, Frank mentioned the book The Power of Pull, which tried to characterize some of the attributes or dimensions of this big shift that we're going through. Our belief is that one of the disruptive elements of this big shift is a move from what we call a business world of stocks to a business world of flows. And what we mean by that is, in the way traditional business was built, it was around developing some proprietary knowledge, protecting that knowledge, making sure nobody else had access to it, stocks of knowledge. Increasingly, in a world that's exponentially changing, whatever you know at any point in time depreciates at an accelerating rate. And so if all you do is hold on to those knowledge stocks and protect those knowledge stocks, you're protecting a diminishing business. The key to success in this world, we believe, is how do you participate in a broader and more diverse range of knowledge flows so you can refresh your knowledge stocks at an accelerating rate. Now, having said that, I will just caution, I'm not by any means saying throw out all your IP and give it away and be done with it, but be much more selective about what is the IP that I really do need to protect, and where and how can I use my existing IP to build these relationships in ecosystems where I will catalyze knowledge flows that will help me to learn faster as well as the other participants in the ecosystem. It's a different perspective.
Annalie wants to say something?
John, I've read all of your books and I love The Power of Pull, and I was wondering if you're working on another book at the moment. What could we look forward to? By the way, there are some, please, I do encourage people to make use of the bookshop. We have most of our authors on the bookstore as well.
My challenge, I've written 7 books, and it's become an obsession. I've now got 2 other books that I'm working on. One is actually integrating the themes of narrative and passion, and so I invite anybody who's interested in that to come up and talk. The other one is more of a kind of classic business focus around what we call patterns of disruption. What are specific patterns of disruption that are likely to occur in more than one market, but not all markets? And what are the attributes of a market that you could look to say, is this market vulnerable to that particular pattern of disruption? We think that's going to be very helpful to executives to anticipate where and how they might be disrupted. Thank you.
John, Frank, I thoroughly enjoyed our session today. May I thank you all for being such an attentive audience. Thanks for your time and have a great day.